how many wives, girlfriends, children inherited the disease and also died or were forever crippled by its effects.
In an age where governments and corporations collect massive amounts of health data, run global vaccine programs, and conduct medical trials across continents, a question quietly lingers in the background. How much trust should ordinary people place in powerful institutions that claim to act in the name of science? That question did not appear out of nowhere. It was shaped by real events that exposed how easily scientific authority can cross ethical lines when accountability disappears. One of the clearest examples is the Tuskegee syphilis study, a government-run experiment that lasted for 40 years in the United States. Hundreds of black men believed they were receiving medical care, yet the program was designed to observe what happened when a deadly disease went untreated. The story is often taught as a historical scandal, but the real issue is much larger. If such a project could exist for decades without public awareness, what lessons should modern societies draw when evaluating today's medical institutions and research programs? Let's find out.
Everyone who knew about this, to my way of thinking, everyone who knew about this and didn't blow the whistle, that didn't shout to high heaven, "This is wrong," is culpable.
In the early 20th century, large parts of the United States still operated under racial segregation. Laws and social practices known as Jim Crow laws separated Black Americans from white institutions, including schools, hospitals, and public services. In rural regions of the South, this separation created a reality where entire communities lived with extremely limited access to healthcare. One of those places was Macon County, Alabama, a largely agricultural area where many black families worked as sharecroppers and struggled with deep poverty. Medical services in the county were scarce. Doctors were few, hospitals were distant, and many residents had never received professional medical treatment in their lives. In this environment, when government doctors began arriving in the early 1930s, offering free health checkups, transportation, and meals, the offer appeared generous rather than suspicious. For men who had spent their lives without reliable health care, the opportunity looked like long overdue attention from the medical system. The project was organized by the United States Public Health Service, which partnered with the respected Tuskegee Institute, an educational institution that had strong ties to the local black community. That partnership helped establish trust. When respected local figures supported the program, it reassured residents that the doctors were there to help. Researchers recruited 600 black men for what was described as a long-term health program. Participants were told they were being treated for an illness called bad blood, a common phrase used in the region to describe a variety of medical problems such as fatigue, anemia, or infections. The phrase was vague enough that few people questioned it, but behind the reassuring language was a very different scientific goal. Doctors involved in the project had already identified that many of the men were infected with syphilis, a serious disease that slowly damages the body over time. Instead of focusing on treatment, the researchers wanted to observe how the illness developed inside the human body over many years. The study aimed to track the disease's progression by monitoring symptoms, recording health changes, and eventually conducting autopsies after the participants died.
I'd like to look at the Tuskegee syphilis study from 1932 to 1972, which was, if we like, the catalyst around which a framework of biomedical ethics was developed. Now, the Tuskegee study was a complex story. It captured the national imagination because it seemed to embody everybody's fears as a worst-case scenario in medical ethics. Tuskegee, as a study, embodied a number of features that contributed to that. Clearly, it demonstrates, as I think we'll see, the corrupting influence of commercial considerations on medicine and medical research.
From the perspective of the scientists, this promised valuable medical data. Long-term observation of untreated disease was rare, and researchers believed the information could deepen their understanding of how the infection affected organs, nerves, and the brain. For the men participating in the study, however, the situation looked completely different. They believed they were part of a government healthcare program that would improve their well-being. Each visit to the clinic reinforced that perception. Participants received examinations, occasional medications that did little to treat the disease, and small benefits such as meals or transportation. Over time, the program became routine. Men returned regularly for checkups, trusting the doctors who had become familiar figures in their community. Families accepted the program as part of everyday life, never realizing that the experiment they were participating in had been designed with a completely different purpose. Years passed quietly. Medical notes accumulated. Researchers carefully documented symptoms and physical changes, while the participants continued believing they were receiving care. The study became deeply embedded in the lives of the men involved, stretching far beyond what anyone had initially expected. But the entire experiment was about to face a moment that would transform its moral meaning. Within a decade, a scientific breakthrough would appear that had the power to cure the very disease the researchers were observing. And that discovery raises the question that begins the next chapter of this story. When medicine finally discovered an effective cure for syphilis, what decision did the researchers make about the men in the study? Scientists had already begun experimenting with a powerful antibiotic that showed remarkable results against bacterial infections. That drug was penicillin, and its success quickly reshaped the global medical landscape. During World War II, doctors discovered that penicillin could effectively eliminate the bacteria responsible for syphilis, often with relatively simple treatment. This discovery changed everything. What had once been a slow, devastating illness capable of destroying the nervous system, heart, and brain suddenly became treatable. Governments and public health agencies launched large-scale campaigns to diagnose infections and distribute penicillin to patients across the United States. Hospitals, military clinics, and community health centers all began using the new antibiotic to stop the disease before it could progress to its most dangerous stages. For most patients, the arrival of penicillin meant hope and recovery. But for the men enrolled in the long-running study in Alabama, the situation unfolded very differently. The researchers overseeing the experiment faced a decision that would define the study's legacy. Their project had been designed to observe how the disease progressed without treatment. If the participants were given penicillin, the infection would disappear, and decades of observational data would come to an abrupt end. The scientific purpose of the experiment would collapse. Instead of closing the study, administrators chose to continue monitoring the participants without introducing the new cure. This decision had consequences that went far beyond a research project. The medical landscape around the study had completely changed. Doctors everywhere were now curing syphilis, preventing the neurological damage and organ failure that had once been common. Yet inside the study, the men remained unaware that a treatment existed that could potentially restore their health.
If left untreated, has really nasty consequences. It can kill you painfully. And in this study, there were subjects who were followed but not given treatment that was known to be effective. This happened over decades' time. Not only that, not surprisingly, these subjects never gave their informed consent to participate in this study. They didn't know what was really going on. And the participants were all African Americans from poor socioeconomic group from Alabama.
Some of the participants encountered opportunities to receive treatment outside the program. During World War II, for example, many American men were drafted into the military, where routine medical examinations screened soldiers for infectious diseases. Soldiers diagnosed with syphilis were typically treated immediately with penicillin. However, records later revealed that administrators connected to the study worked to keep participants from receiving such treatment elsewhere. Maintaining the experiment required keeping the disease untreated, even as the rest of the medical world moved forward with new solutions. As the years passed, the contrast became more dramatic. Public health campaigns celebrated the decline of syphilis cases thanks to the new antibiotic. Medical textbooks described the infection as a disease that could now be controlled. Meanwhile, in rural Alabama, the study quietly continued observing the long-term effects of untreated infection. The men involved still believed they were receiving medical care from government doctors. Many trusted the program completely, returning regularly for examinations and checkups. For them, the study represented access to health care in a region where such services had long been scarce. Yet beneath that appearance of care, the experiment had entered a new phase. It was no longer simply documenting a disease that lacked a cure. It had become an observation of what happened when a treatable illness remained untreated. For decades, the program continued almost unnoticed outside the medical bureaucracy that managed it. But eventually, someone inside the system would begin asking uncomfortable questions about what was happening. And that leads directly to the next turning point in this story. Who was the person inside the government who finally decided that the public needed to know about the experiment? For decades, the study continued almost unnoticed outside the small circle of officials who managed it. Medical reports were written, examinations were conducted, and the participants continued visiting clinics, believing they were receiving care. Inside government files, the program was treated as just another long-term research project run by the United States Public Health Service. But by the late 1960s, the world around the study had changed dramatically. The civil rights movement had forced American society to confront racial discrimination more openly. New discussions about medical ethics were emerging as well, especially after the horrors revealed during the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi doctors were prosecuted for conducting brutal experiments on prisoners. Those trials produced the Nuremberg Code, a landmark set of ethical principles stating that people must voluntarily consent to participate in medical research. Against that backdrop, the long-running experiment in Alabama began to look increasingly troubling to some individuals within the system itself. One of those individuals was a young public health investigator named Peter Buxton. Buxton was not part of the original research team. When he first learned about the study while reviewing internal materials, he was shocked by what he found. The documents revealed that hundreds of men had been observed for decades without being fully informed about their condition and without receiving the treatment that had become standard medical practice. Buxton initially tried to address the issue through official channels. He submitted complaints and requested that the program be re-evaluated. From his perspective, the study clearly violated emerging ethical standards that required transparency and informed consent, but his concerns were repeatedly dismissed. Administrators overseeing the study defended it as scientifically valuable. They argued that the project had already produced decades of unique medical data and that stopping it would waste the research investment. Within bureaucratic discussions, the participants were often described as subjects whose continued observation was essential for completing the study. Frustrated by the lack of action, Buxton eventually reached a difficult decision. If internal warnings were not enough to stop the experiment, perhaps public scrutiny would. He contacted journalists and shared information about the study with reporters from the Associated Press. The reporters began investigating the claims, verifying documents, and interviewing officials involved in the program. As they pieced together the story, the full scale of the experiment became impossible to ignore. In July 1972, the Associated Press published an explosive report revealing that a government-funded medical study had allowed hundreds of black men to live for decades with untreated syphilis, while doctors quietly observed the disease's progression. The reaction was immediate and intense. Newspapers across the country carried the story. Television broadcasts discussed the revelations in detail. Medical experts, civil rights leaders, and politicians demanded explanations for how such a program could continue for so long without public knowledge. Within days, the controversy had grown into a national scandal. Government officials quickly announced that the experiment would be terminated. Investigations were launched to examine how the study had been allowed to continue for 40 years. For many Americans, the revelation forced a painful realization. A research project conducted in the name of science had crossed ethical boundaries that should never have been crossed. Yet closing the study did not resolve the deeper consequences. Families had already lost loved ones. Communities that trusted government health programs now questioned whether that trust had been misplaced. And as the nation began grappling with the implications of the scandal, a new challenge emerged. How could the government repair the damage caused by decades of secrecy and suffering? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Soon after the story became public, legal action followed. Survivors of the study and relatives of those who had died filed a lawsuit against the federal government. The case argued that the participants had been misled about their condition and denied access to proper treatment. Lawyers pointed out that the men believed they were receiving health care when, in reality, they had been part of a research program designed to observe disease rather than cure it. The lawsuit eventually led to a settlement in 1973. The U.S. government agreed to provide financial compensation to the victims and their families. The settlement also included long-term medical benefits for surviving participants and healthcare support for some relatives who had been affected. For the individuals involved, the settlement represented an official recognition that something had gone wrong. Yet many observers noted that no financial compensation could fully repair decades of suffering or restore the lives that had already been lost. Beyond the courtroom, the scandal forced a deeper conversation within the medical community itself. Universities, hospitals, and research organizations began asking difficult questions about how such an experiment had been approved and allowed to continue. The controversy exposed gaps in the system that governed human experimentation. One major outcome of these discussions was the creation of stricter oversight for medical research. New regulations required scientists to explain the purpose of studies clearly to participants and obtain voluntary consent before beginning any experiment. Research proposals also had to be reviewed by independent committees to ensure that ethical standards were being followed. These review panels, often called institutional review boards, became a permanent feature of medical research in the United States. Their role is to examine proposed studies and ensure that participants are not exposed to unnecessary risks or deception. The scandal also triggered wider public discussions about trust between communities and the healthcare system. For many people, especially within Black communities, the experiment became a symbol of how institutions could misuse authority when transparency was absent. As these debates unfolded, historians, journalists, and policymakers began documenting the full history of the study. Reports detailed how the experiment had been planned, how it continued after new treatments became available, and how internal warnings had failed to stop it. The story gradually moved from being a shocking news revelation to becoming a case study in medical ethics taught in universities and public health programs. Yet despite the reforms and the settlement, a deeper question lingered for years. Governments can change policies, and institutions can introduce new safeguards, but repairing broken trust is a far more complicated challenge. Which brings us to the next chapter of this story. Would the government ever directly acknowledge responsibility for what had happened to the men and their families? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. That moment would not arrive until 1997, more than 2 decades after the experiment had been exposed, and more than 60 years after it had first begun. By that time, only a small number of the original participants were still alive. Many of the men who had unknowingly taken part in the study had already passed away, along with family members who had endured the consequences of the disease spreading within their households. In May of that year, the remaining survivors and relatives of the participants were invited to the White House for a formal ceremony. The event was meant to confront the past directly and acknowledge the harm caused by the experiment. During the ceremony, President Bill Clinton delivered an official apology on behalf of the United States government.
What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
In his remarks, the president acknowledged that the men had been misled and that the government had failed in its responsibility to protect its citizens. He described the study as a profound moral mistake and recognized that the victims had been denied the respect and dignity that every patient deserves. For the survivors present at the ceremony, the apology carried emotional significance. Many had lived long enough to witness their story move from secrecy to national scandal and finally to official recognition. Hearing the government publicly acknowledge the injustice provided a measure of validation for experiences that had once been hidden from the public. But the apology also raised broader reflections about the meaning of accountability. By 1997, the world had changed dramatically since the study began in the 1930s. Medical ethics had evolved, civil rights protections had expanded, and public awareness of research standards had grown significantly. The apology, therefore, served not only as a gesture toward the victims, but also as a reminder of how societies must confront their past in order to move forward. At the same time, the ceremony underscored the limits of such gestures. An apology delivered decades later could recognize wrongdoing, but it could not undo the years during which participants believed they were receiving treatment while their illness progressed. It could not restore the lives that had been lost or erase the suffering experienced by families affected by the disease. Still, the event marked an important step in publicly acknowledging the ethical failures that had allowed the experiment to continue for so long. It also reinforced the idea that institutions must remain accountable not only for present actions, but also for decisions made in the past. Yet even after the apology, the story continued to influence debates about medicine, trust, and power. The legacy of the experiment did not end with a presidential statement. Instead, it raised a lasting question that still echoes today. What lessons should societies draw from this history when evaluating the relationship between scientific progress and human rights in the modern world? By the time the official apology was delivered in 1997, the experiment that began in rural Alabama had already become one of the most widely discussed ethical failures in modern medical history. Yet the significance of the Tuskegee syphilis study did not end with the apology or the reforms that followed. In many ways, its real impact continues to shape conversations about science, power, and trust in the present day. Modern medicine operates on a global scale. Governments and pharmaceutical companies conduct large clinical trials across continents. Public health campaigns gather massive amounts of biological data. New technologies, from genetic sequencing to artificial intelligence, are transforming how researchers study disease and develop treatments. These advances promise enormous benefits, but they also raise important questions about oversight and accountability. The history of the Tuskegee study reminds us that scientific progress does not automatically guarantee ethical behavior. Even highly respected institutions can make decisions that prioritize research goals over human dignity if proper safeguards are absent. In the early decades of the 20th century, the absence of clear ethical standards allowed a project like the Tuskegee experiment to continue far longer than it should have. Today, the safeguards created in response to that scandal are embedded in modern research systems. Medical studies must follow strict rules requiring informed consent, meaning that participants must understand the purpose, risks, and potential benefits of an experiment before agreeing to take part. Independent oversight committees now evaluate research proposals to ensure that human subjects are treated ethically. These reforms exist largely because the failures of the Tuskegee study forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between science and power. However, the legacy of the experiment extends beyond regulatory reforms. It also influences how communities view healthcare institutions. Trust between patients and medical systems is essential for effective treatment and public health programs. When that trust is damaged, the consequences can persist for generations. Many historians and public health experts have noted that the story of the Tuskegee study became deeply embedded in cultural memory, particularly within African American communities. The experiment is often referenced in discussions about medical transparency, government accountability, and the responsibilities of research institutions toward vulnerable populations. At the same time, the story serves as a reminder that progress often emerges from confronting past mistakes. The public outrage that followed the exposure of the experiment led to significant improvements in research ethics, protections for participants, and broader discussions about human rights in science. In that sense, the legacy of Tuskegee is not only about wrongdoing, but also about the capacity of societies to learn from historical failures and build stronger safeguards for the future. But history also leaves us with a final reflection that goes beyond one experiment or one country. Scientific discovery will always carry enormous influence in shaping the future of humanity. The question is not whether science should continue advancing. It must, but how societies ensure that the pursuit of knowledge never again overlooks the dignity and rights of the people whose lives make that progress possible. Let us know in the comment section. Was the apology enough? Can the US government be trusted again? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.